afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Vietnam Viewpoints, a conference on American policy in Vietnam. Before proceeding with the introductions of today's speakers, however, I have been asked to announce that Ralph Nader, critic and author, will speak in the ballroom at 1 o'clock directly following the current debate. The topic of his speech will be corporations and consumers. The topic of today's debate is Vietnam, ornithology and images. The participants are, on my left, Mr. Amron Katz of the Rand Corporation, who will speak in support of the American policy in Vietnam, and on my right, Mr. Adam Yarmolinsky, former Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, who will speak in opposition to current U.S. policy. Mr. Yarmolinsky is a former Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense under Robert McNamara. He also served as Deputy Director of the Anti-Poverty Task Force. He is now a professor at Harvard Law School, and as a concerned private citizen, he is speaking here today on behalf of Senator Robert Kennedy. Mr. Katz is employed by the Rand Corporation, where he is a member of the senior staff. He is a senior member of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He is a member of the National Planning Association's Committee on Security Through Arms Control and helped draft the widely circulated pamphlet 1970 Without Arms Control. He is also on the board of sponsors of the magazine War, Peace Report. He has participated in several conferences for strategy for peace and in several meetings of the American Assembly, both here and abroad. He is also a member of the U.S. group which participated in the December 1960 disarmament discussions in Moscow. He also participated as an expert on the disarmament in the 1962 Accra Assembly in Accra, Ghana. Since early 1964, Mr. Katz has been almost exclusively concerned with Vietnam. He has made two extensive trips to Southeast Asia in 1964 and 1966, visiting South Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Okinawa, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, and Malaysia. He has spoken and debated widely on the Vietnam problem, both here and abroad. The format for today's debate will be a presentation first by Mr. Katz, then a presentation by Mr. Yarmolinsky, then each man will have a 5-minute rebuttal period, then the program will be thrown open to questions and answers for the remainder of the period. Mr. Katz will speak first.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me the opportunity to come here and dissent. The title for today's presentation is really the title of my talk, and I called it Vietnam, Ornithology and Images, Some Notes for a College Audience. I find and trust that college audiences are different than most other audiences. We shall see. At least as I see my task today, it is to discuss some words, some ideas, hopefully discussing both ideas and words which are not yet frozen in concrete and may stir on your part some re-examination of your views of these concepts and words. I, and I'm sure like you, am thoroughly fed up to the gills with repetition and regurgitation of rhetoric and invective, no matter where it comes from, whether from the Senate, the hallowed halls of universities, or even from the sheer ramparts in San Francisco. You can observe, as I have observed, that those who occupied our time by taking refuge in the dim and arguable past, or else in hiding in a distant and unavailable future, are really trying to avoid the present. Don't misunderstand me. I know that you've all heard at least 100 times Santayana's famous dictum that those who ignore the past are condemned to repeat it. And I certainly admit that those who never look to the future will suddenly wake up in it and wonder how they got there. The late Adlai Stevenson, on an occasion somewhat like this, speaking before what turned out to be a larger audience, once said, "My job here," he says, "is to talk." He says, "Yours is to listen. Let's hope we finish at about the same time." I am appearing here today close upon the tumultuous political earthquakes that have all happened in this year. The dust has not yet settled. My opponent is here campaigning for Senator Kennedy. I'm only campaigning for some ideas. And I suspect that Adam and I are not as far apart as other occasions which have found me on this platform here at this university. But first, I suppose I better give you my position on Vietnam and see how you and Adam differ from it. First, I want the bombing to stop, both in North Vietnam and South Vietnam. I want the fighting to stop. I want the United States out of Vietnam. I want peace to come to Southeast Asia, and the people who live there genuinely free to make their own decisions. Sounds like a bold platform, doesn't it? Well, it turned out that that statement that I just read could be signed by President Johnson, President Hugh, Nixon, Bobby Kennedy, Senator McCarthy, Ho Chi Minh, General LeMay, Kosygin, Goldwater, you name it. You name him, he could sign it. Clearly, the argument, therefore, if that's true, and I assert it is true, is not about that position, but about how we get there from here and what it looks like when we get there. It's very much like our constant arguments about disarmament. Nobody argues about the end point. The only question is about the route and the conditions and trails and pitfalls and bear traps to be found on the way. The sad fact, of course, is that there is no position that I've heard or that is potentially available on the Vietnam problem, which, if occupied, will yield happiness, at least for very long. In other words, if you came here to be happy, go listen to Fromm. Now let's turn to an examination of the issues via words. And of course, the first word which has contaminated the discussion like radioactive fallout that settled on everything is a word unknown till about 8 years ago, not yet in the dictionaries, but used by all. By Ho, by Mao, by the Soviets, by Ramparts, by Herman Kahn, by LBJ, by J.K. Galbraith, by everyone. The word is escalation. Now, what does it mean? To tell you the truth, I don't really know. And I suspect it means different things to different people. And I suggest also we all better pause and examine a word, because it was a word that was not in use till 8 years ago. The natural question is, what was the word we used to use instead of escalation? I've gone around asking experts, often self-appointed and self-anointed experts, what was the word that used to be used before escalation came on the scene? And then they reflect on it a moment and say the word was widen a war, intensify the war. But these other formulations do not carry the invidious connotation that escalation does. In fact, it suggests in a faint reversal of the old statement or cliche about art imitating nature, perhaps in a reversal of that dictum, we couldn't escalate till we had the word. My own observation of both users and usage of the word suggests that it's the image, which is part 3 of my title for today. The automatic, inexorable, impersonal, indifferent machine that somehow only goes up, and once you set foot on it, bang, you're carried to the summit. But you should say, if I gave you the opportunity to say it now, I'm sure many of you would, there is a new end point that didn't occur that wasn't available a few years ago. The bomb, the big bomb with capital B at both ends, World War III and all that. This point is a good point, and I know it's good and I know it's valid. I've been making it for years. But I ask you to think for a moment, how could the United States have escalated every day or every week for years and not gotten any closer to the top of this imaginary staircase, automatic staircase? One of two things, or both, must have been true, and I assert they're both true. The steps must have been very small, or the end point infinitely far off or indefinitely far off, or both. Which brings me to a major assertion, an assertion which unfortunately I cannot prove, but which I hold deeply. There is less danger of all-out war today than at any time since 1961. Now, why did I pick 61? Not many of you here remember 1931, or 41, or 51, but anybody in this room ought to remember 61. Now, let me choose to remind you what happened in 61. First of all, we started out that year with a bang, what I call a spherical fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, By spherical fiasco, I mean no matter which way you look at it, it was a fiasco, with enough blame to be partitioned in large quantities in all directions. This was followed by the Vienna meeting between Khrushchev, a very senior man in the Soviet hierarchy at that time, and the then new and largely untried young President John F. Kennedy. And by all accounts, recently confirmed by Secretary Rusk, Kennedy came away pretty shaken by Khrushchev's statements, by his position, by his intransigence. This was followed, in fact, was caused the Berlin crisis, which saw reserves called up, which saw the infamous wall built in the middle of that year, which saw, starting on or about September 1st, 1961, the resumption of testing in the atmosphere by the Soviets, the abrogation of the moratorium on atomic testing. They're testing, and what a way they tested. All of you who remember it can't forget it, I'm sure, but let me recall it to those of you who have forgotten it. 50 megaton bombs, 20 megaton bombs, 1 or 2 a day, every day for about a month. At precisely that moment, I was meeting with some Soviets in Stowe, Vermont, discussing disarmament and cessation of testing. So testing got resumed. And there was a crisis. It was a genuine crisis. Berlin was on the main track between here and Moscow. It wasn't a sideshow, it wasn't a minor exercise, it was the main show, in the main tent with only one ring. That was the year of the fallout shelter madness, when everybody started digging up their backyard, putting in old boilers to live in. So I assert we haven't been close to war since that time, as close as we were at that time, including the missile crisis of '62, which was not on the main line. It occurred over Cuba. And we've steadily gotten away from the danger of all-out war. Back to escalation. My advice is simple. If you must use the word, don't. Let me turn to other words. Of all the words that have contaminated the Vietnam debate, perhaps a set of words involving victory, win/lose, have befouled the air more than any others. What do they mean? There is, as in many other conditions surrounding the Vietnam problem, a terrible asymmetry that exists. Let me explain that. Lose for us and for the South Vietnamese retains most of its classic meaning. Win does not, any more than it did in Korea. Let me ask you just to think for a moment, what does it mean for Ho Chi Minh to lose? Does it mean what the same thing as it means for South Vietnam to lose? Obviously not. No one has dreamt or even suggested or has any plans or has even speculated that lose for Ho Chi Minh means somebody arrests him, somebody tries him as a war criminal, somebody shoots him, somebody takes over the country, somebody has elections. No, he's got his country. It's just the same way. We've guaranteed its inviolability to invasion, to overthrow. And I suggest in passing one think about these words. One of the issues, and I will leave this or relegate this to the question period, so always comes up in Vietnam debate, and erroneously, surrounding the election issue of '56. By the Geneva Agreements of '54, the protocol signed, or the protocol unsigned by everybody, but simply delivered a final declaration of the conference. There were supposed to be elections held to unify the country in '56. They were not held. What about it? Somebody asked me a question, I'll go into it in detail. One of the other words that contaminates the debate is commitment. We say we have a commitment to Vietnam. What does that mean? Well, everybody would like to find a legal piece of paper or a legal definition of that commitment. But I urge you to consider our commitment to Israel. Israel serves as a convenient matrix to examine many of these issues, because just as the desert is defoliated as compared with Vietnam, so the arguments get defoliated. Let me give you a quick synopsis. Last May, a good friend of mine and my next-door neighbor, who I define as a Vietnik, and I don't mean the term invidiously, it's a shorthand for a complicated collection of ideas, came to me and said, what the hell are we going to do about the Middle East? I said, what do you mean? What should we do? He said, we have a commitment to Israel. I said, what kind of a commitment? He said, well, in '57, Eisenhower wrote Ben-Gurion a letter with a commitment. I says, you know, for 2 years I've been trying to tell you about a similar letter he wrote in the same year to Diem. How come you like this letter, you don't like that letter? Well, I know how come, but I wanted him to think about it. And I agreed with him. We did have a commitment in both places. He said, what are we going to do? And I thought, in an attempt to bait him, an entirely successful attempt, I'll relate, I said, well, the first thing we should do is consult world opinion. What does the world want us to do? And if they don't want us to do this, we won't do it. He said, that's a lot of baloney. He says, that's ridiculous. They're not involved. I says, right. I says, then the next thing we should do is, of course, throw the matter to the United Nations, where it was, of course, there reposing uneasily. And we all saw that on television for the 2-week spectacular. He said, that's also ridiculous. I says, above all, we should then consult our allies and not do anything unilaterally. He says, that's also ridiculous. I said, now take that set of statements and examine them against Vietnam and examine in your heart of hearts the reasons, the differences, and the similarities. I leave it to you to do. The Middle East is a convenient matrix, I assert, to examine all these issues. It's defoliated. Another thing that contaminates Vietnam debate is the desire that always occurs in the question period, and I hope it doesn't happen today. Someone says, but you know, tell me, why are we in Vietnam? And I always wish I had a fortune cookie in my pocket with a little slip that I could pull out and read it and give it to them to memorize. That's the single reason syndrome, which affects not only Vietnam but many other things. There never is, there never was, nor does there exist a single reason. And people were unwilling to digest and hold simultaneously a number of independent reasons, no one of which might appeal at this stage to their reason or their emotion as sufficient cause, yet together make the thing sufficient. So don't ask me for the single reason, because I haven't got the fortune cookie slip in my pocket. Now we come to part 2 of the title phrase, the ornithology. Another thing that has contaminated Vietnam debate, I notice it didn't today, is to identify Adam as a dove and me as a hawk. I've been allergic to such oversimplified caricature definitions for many years. English, by far the richest language in the world, capable of the utmost precision, gets continuously debased for some mystical shorthand reasons, such as the ones I've just given you. I don't understand it. I've been struck over the years listening to and reading Khrushchev's speeches by the use of animals in his speech. And it was said, and it was a sub-branch of Kremlinology, kind of barnyard zoology branch of Kremlinology, which examined the animals that were found in his debates and arguments. And when they were simple animals like those found in the barnyard, he was pretty peaceable. When his speeches started getting peppered with forest animals, then they said, watch out, Khrushchev is getting angry. Well, I've examined the animals, and they don't really lend themselves to adequate characterization. Neither do the fish. You can have shark, stingray, and then you're about through. Neither do lizards, alligators, crocodiles, reptiles, or insects. But the birds really come through. And of course, we've all been peppered fully with hawk and dove. I used to be an old amateur bird watcher, and I went back to my Peterson to look up a few more birds, all of which I find have exact parallels in the human condition in the United States. I mean, I'll read these to you, and I'll let you in your mind's eye assign characters on the current political scene who fit these descriptions, and even nations. But of course, characterizing nations is Fromm's business, and that's going on at the moment in Royce Hall. They're not only hawks and doves, but eagles, owls, crows, buzzards, dodos, ostriches, parrots, chickens, got a candidate for every one of these, shrikes, mockingbirds, vultures, yellow-bellied sapsuckers, coots, loons, pigeons, bustards, grouse, titmice, quail, and common snipe, among 1,000 others. And it is truly amazing how with this rich menu to draw from, everybody has to get polarized as a hawk or a dove. But broadening the spectrum, as I've just done, for semi-facetious and partly serious reasons, doesn't make it fit necessarily. Here's another good one, the Domino Theory. This unfelicitous description, coined by Eisenhower in a press conference a number of years ago, is subject to much calumny, much abuse, much derogation, and much refutation. Actually, the only thing wrong with the Domino Theory is that damn word, Domino Theory. And if someone could only find another phrase, it's because of the image that nobody likes Domino Theory. Everyone remembers in his childhood setting up a row of dominoes and then pushing the first one, in which case they automatically, inexorably, mechanically fall in a precise order that can be predicted in advance. And of course, nobody who uses the Domino Theory as shorthand for the events that would happen or follow an unhappy exit, an unfavorable exit of the United States from the Southeast Asia scene, has that image. No one can predict which is the next country, although Laos is a good bet, or in what order they would fall, when they would fall, whether it would be mechanical or by osmosis. But fall they would. The objection is to the domino theory. There are many other words, and let me just list these without describing them or without analyzing them. Aggression, which the UN has been unable to define in all its terms. You see, it's very handy, if you want to be accused of being an aggressor, to cross the line on a certain day with your flag flying, with your bugle blowing, with artillery shelling, as the North Koreans did on June 24th, 1950 at 0400 in the morning. That was clear. They came from one place, they went to another place, and they did it in a noisy, definite, discontinuous fashion. Unfortunately, what's happening in Vietnam isn't like that, so people assert it's a civil war. And when you say, no, it's not a civil war, the answer is, the rebuttal is, are there no elements of civil war? And the answer to that is, of course there are elements of civil war. It's a mixed up situation that doesn't lend itself to simple descriptors. Another one revolves around the term democracy. Are we trying to build a democracy in Southeast Asia? Hell no, we're not, because we can't get there from here. Any more than you can get from the bottom of the curve, which has several definitive points on it, to the top of the curve without going through several phases. Walt Rostow has a theory of stages of economic growth. Nobody has a theory. I have a conjecture. There must be stages of political growth analogous to that. I would invite all of you to think for a moment how many democracies there are today in this world that we're living in. You will find democracy, by even stretching the definition fairly widely, will hardly take in 20 people, 20 nations. Hardly. So democracy is kind of rare. That's not our business in Southeast Asia. Our business is freedom and independence, which is not identical with democracy. Let me skip rapidly here. You see, I might let you in a little secret, a planning secret. A few moments before Adam showed up at 2 minutes to 12, it looked like I was going to be the only speaker, and so I kind of got myself organized for that. So I now realize I'm not, so let me disorganize myself for that. Let me turn quickly to some other topics. Where do we stand today and where are we going? I would refer all of you to a marvelous little micro card available only in your reference library, your graduate reference library, where I read it in full on a beautiful microcard reader not 4 weeks ago. This is a pamphlet by one Charles Stille, S-T-I-L-L-E, with a big French slash over the last E, entitled How a Free People Conduct a Long War. It was a pamphlet which those of you who read The New Leader know Lincoln used to read from time to time and read out loud to visiting senators and other dignitaries. But it's not a description of the then raging Civil War. It's a description of how the English fought the Peninsular War in Spain about 50 or 60 years earlier. I would recommend all of you to leave here, or wait for Ralph Nader to speak at 1, and then leave here, hie over to the library and get that card and read it. It's beautiful. But now all of our conclusions, our feelings, our estimates, our evaluations about how we're doing in Vietnam and where we should go from here depend on an image of what the Vietnam enterprise is really about right now. My own image, and I use the word image coupled with all the caveats in which I condemned other people's images not more than a few moments ago, is a kind of a stool held up by 3 legs. One leg, which is made of steel, is the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam. That can't be crippled. And the other guy knows it. He's failed attempting it. The other leg is the government of Vietnam, called in the literature the GVN. This is a leg which is certainly not made of steel. There's some question whether it's made of spaghetti or plastic, but it's not steel. The third leg, which, by the way, so far at least, in the events surrounding the Tet Offensive at the end of January and February, has shown itself to be weaker than the other 2 legs, is the United States home front. Now, clearly, this is my view of how Ho Chi Minh sees the entire enterprise. Not to be suffered military defeat, but political defeat. Political fatigue on a home front. And he resonated the Tet Offensive against the United States home front, found it the weakest of the 3 legs, which it has remained. At the moment, you all know that we're attempting to start negotiations in Paris. It's going to be very difficult for new reasons to conduct them in Paris. It's going to be very difficult for all the old reasons why it was difficult to conduct them in Korea, which I recall to all of you, the negotiations took about 2 years or more. But it's going to be difficult physically in Paris. It's going to be difficult, first of all, to get the North Vietnamese to admit, believe it or not, they're hewing to the line, as they did to Dave Schoenberg when he was last in Hanoi just several months ago. They're hewing to the line that they have no troops in South Vietnam. If they can maintain that position, well, I don't really understand how they can maintain it, but I don't really understand how they maintain it as far as they have. Now, of course, the next item to watch in these negotiations is the agenda. To the communist negotiators, the agenda is the main thing. That's the object of the negotiations. Once an item gets on the agenda, the determination has been made as to what the conclusion will be. To the United States style, and hopefully we've learned some lessons from our sad experiences in Korea, the agenda is a method of getting on with the discussion. We're in a hurry to get over the agenda so we can get on with the discussions. The communists spend great amount of time on the agenda, and you'll observe that. Now, one day the problem will be over in Vietnam. What will happen to the United States then? My own sad prediction, not that I hope so, in fact I hope the contrary, is that we will go isolationist. Another key word, I assure you it's a key word, a flag word that contaminates the debate. And I haven't got the time, and I won't take the time to define it carefully. What I mean is we'll gradually disengage our positions around the world. We don't have to. One can say you can pull a finger out of Vietnam and keep all your other fingers together, but in the process of pulling that finger out, the other fingers are coming along, the arm goes with the fingers, and we'll all be home. And I think it'll be a sad day. I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotations. I'm sure Adam knows where I stole this from. He'll know it in a moment. I'll tell you in advance. I stole it off of his wall when he had an office in the Pentagon, and it was the only damn thing he had on his wall, which was quite surprising. It was written script very large. Those who would carry on the great public schemes must be proof against the most fatiguing delays, the most mortifying disappointments, the most shocking insults, and most of all the presumptuous judgment of the ignorant upon their designs. This was written by Edmund Burke, probably about 1797. Now, whether he feels that way now, I don't know. We'll hear in a few moments. But at least when he was in the establishment, that's how he felt. I assume it was not left there by his predecessor, because this was after Adam had been in office for a while. Of course, the fundamental problem is war itself. War is an organized obscenity. But it is not enough for me to say that and believe it and act on that. Those who would have us pull a Gandhi never really understood that Gandhi was blessed with a fortuitous choice of opponent. He didn't pick his opponent was right there. Were we blessed with an opponent like the British, we could conduct negotiations much more easily and avoid many problems. In conclusion, and I've probably taken up some of Adam's time here, for which I apologize, my preference today has been to congeal and clarify a few ideas rather than to conceal and confuse many. I hope I've succeeded at least partially. I'm sorry and I apologize for omitting some topics and for perhaps conveying, you may not get this impression, some uncertainty in these matters. When I was much younger and problems were simple, or maybe it was the other way around, I was more certain of everything, and everything fit into one of two boxes, good or bad. But I leave the blowing of the certain trumpet to others on this program today, or others else in the audience. I will conclude with one more quotation and then step back. There are few fields of human endeavor where wishful thinking and self-delusion are as common or as dangerous as in foreign policy. We demand simple answers to the most complex questions confronting human intelligence. We expect consistency in policy, though the facts themselves are full of contradictions. We should like an easy way to carry a heavy burden, an agreeable way to perform disagreeable tasks, a cheap way to bring about an expensive result. Dean Rusk, 1952. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Katz. Mr. Yarmolinsky.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should all be grateful to Mr. Katz, as I am, for indicating to us in an elegant and delightful fashion that this problem is more complicated than at least some of those who examine it tend to see it. I think it's complicated too. I don't disagree with any of the complicating observations that Mr. Katz has had to offer us, but I'm more concerned about what we do about it. And I'd like to talk to you very briefly about what I think we should be doing about it. And since, as your chairman announced, I'm here in California, trotting around from campus to campus with a briefcase full of blue books that I still have to correct, campaigning for Robert Kennedy, I'll take the liberty of saying that the views that I'm expressing are not only mine, but more important for your interest, they're his. And they've been expressed by him consistently for a period of several years. Now, it seems to me that the people of the United States, the majority of the people of the United States have discovered, and the government of the United States is beginning to discover what I think should have been apparent for some time, and that is that we can't do what we are proposing to do in Vietnam except at a cost which we are not willing and morally should not undertake to pay, a cost in American lives and treasure, a cost in loss of attention to the things that have to be taken care of here at home, and a cost in the destruction of the land and country of Vietnam, North and South, which is disproportionate to the object. Now, some have discovered that maybe we shouldn't even have tried. I'm frank to say that as one who was part of the Kennedy administration, I was wrong back in 1961 and 62. I thought this was something that we were justified in doing and that we could do at a cost both to them and us, which was obviously a good deal less than it turned out to be in fact. The only person I know in the Kennedy administration who has a 100% track record on this subject is George Ball, who back in January 1961 said, look, if you start to do what you're doing now, I can predict where you'll be in 1965 and 66 and 67 and 68, and he was absolutely right. The only thing is that he's not now running for public office. The possibility, indeed, I would almost say the certainty, of our achieving the objectives we have set for ourselves in Vietnam is still there. Now, it could be done, but at what a cost? 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 500,000 casualties a year of Americans, how many more million casualties of Vietnamese? Would there be a country left in Vietnam? Would there be a society? Would there be a tree left standing? Well, I suppose there would still be acres and square miles of jungle, but that doesn't make a country. I suggest that if you ask yourself what the price would be, you come out with the inevitable conclusion that this is not something that the United States could do as a matter of objective reality or is entitled to do as a matter of political morality. Now, if we can't do it, how do we disentangle ourselves? Mr. Katz says we should stop the bombing. I say we should stop the bombing too, and I say we should stop it now, all of it. The President has stopped part of the bombing in North Vietnam. I say we should stop all of the bombing of North Vietnam. And I also say that to stop the bombing of all of North Vietnam would not have any effect on the rate of infiltration of men and supplies into South Vietnam, because it has been proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that this whole enormous bombing effort was just about enough to prevent the North Vietnamese from sending men and supplies down to the South at a rate higher than the rate they wanted to send them down anyway. Now, second, on the ground in South Vietnam, we should abandon the tactics of search and destroy, and we should adopt the tactics of clear and hold. What that means is that we should stop trying to kill as many Viet Cong as we can. The only consequence that has is that the Viet Cong recruit faster and more people, and a larger proportion of the civilian population eventually gets killed off. We should stop going into valleys where we've been several times before and taking those valleys at great loss of American lives and North Vietnamese lives and lives of South Vietnamese civilians, figures that have come out on the incidental civilian casualties I find more shocking than the figures on combatant casualties. We should stop going to these valleys and taking them and then letting them go back to the Viet Cong and having to go back and take them all over again a few months later. And thirdly, we should insist that the present government of South Vietnam begin to negotiate, not just at the national level, but at the local level, the village level, the district level, the province level, with the National Liberation Front and the Viet Cong. It doesn't seem to me inevitable that that negotiation is going to result in a political victory for the National Liberation Front, for the communist forces in South Vietnam, but I think one has to admit that possibility. On the other hand, I point out that if we had not shifted the balance in the election that was held in South Vietnam last fall, it seems reasonably clear that a non-communist peace candidate would have won the election in South Vietnam. Might be worth trying. If we did those three things, it seems to me we will be able to conclude the negotiations that have now begun in Paris certainly not within a short time, but without their dragging on forever, and we will be able to bring home the more than 500,000 American men who are over there. The negotiations may result in leaving an international peacekeeping force of some kind. That may not be an outcome of the negotiation, but in any event, the net effect will be, I suggest, I venture to predict, if we adopt this policy, we'll be out, and Hanoi will be out, and I don't know what will happen to South Vietnam, but I think there is a reasonable possibility of it surviving as a non-communist government, and I suggest that given the cost of pursuing any other alternative, this is the realistic alternative that's available to us, and it's the one that we ought to pursue now. Now, I haven't talked about ornithology. I haven't talked about escalation. It doesn't seem to me that one needs to bring any of these chameleon words into play. I think one can discuss the issues here simply in terms of what's possible and what makes sense. There were one or two points that Mr. Katz made that I'd like to cover just by way of parentheses, if I may. First, I agree with him that there's less danger of all-out war today than there has been at any time since 1961, but I don't think that's a reason to continue the present bloodletting in Vietnam. I agree with him that the various alternatives that he offered his friend as an alternative to the American commitment to Israel are not realistic alternatives, but I think there is a significant difference between the state of Israel and the quasi-state that exists in South Vietnam. I don't see the Domino Theory as having more than metaphorical relevance to the problem at hand, but I don't think you need either to accept or reject the physical facts about dominoes in order to decide what you're going to do in the present situation, which involves people. Nor do I think that one has to accept or reject any notions about Western-style democracy in Vietnam, which certainly we don't have, in order to decide what can and can't be done. Lastly, I come to Mr. Katz's three-legged stool, the steel leg of the U.S. military presence, the plastic or spaghetti leg of the government of South Vietnam, and he suggests the even weaker leg of the attitude of the people in the United States. Well, I suggest there may be some logical relationship, some relationship of cause and effect between the plastic or spaghetti quality of the second leg and the judgment that the United States people have made in their wisdom about the third leg. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmolinsky. Mr. Katz?
Adams' program for a strategy to pursue at this moment in South Vietnam sounds to me, and is, very much like Senator Kennedy's remarks, which were made before the Paris conferences even began. Now, I would tend to argue that the kind of a program you would like to propose at this moment can't be unaffected by the fact that negotiations of some sort have started, or the process of starting negotiations has started. The three-part program, as I recall, were stop the bombing of North Vietnam entirely, stop the search and destroy operations in South Vietnam, and have the government of South Vietnam immediately start negotiations at various levels with the NLF. Let me take these backwards. Suppose it were really true in our heart of hearts that we already arrived at an agreement with the South Vietnamese government to permit them, or to have them offer at some time as a negotiating point, that they would indeed negotiate with the NLF, that they would indeed give them a portion of the government. I have no idea, of course, nor any information, private or otherwise, that this is the case. Clearly, it's lousy negotiating procedure to give away your thing now. Suppose I wanted to sell Adam my car, and I start out by saying, look, I really want $2,000 for this machine, but I'm going to negotiate seriously with you, but if this negotiation drags on for 2 months, I'm going to give you the damn car. If I make that announcement in advance, I would argue I have very poor chances of coming out with any cash for that car at all. Now, that's over-caricatured, but it's something like that. I think I know quite a bit about the bombing of North Vietnam, its difficulties, its dilemmas, its problems. My own extremely strong feeling is that we were victimized by the United States strategic establishment, which on other occasions I like to number myself in, which thought we were dealing with a very sophisticated opponent who had read all our literature, who were good Talmudists, who could read between the lines, could understand the signals we were sending them when we started to bomb North Vietnam. And the signal we were sending them is, look, this is a sample. We can do much worse. Now, the trouble is, this fellow was a coarse fellow who not only was unschooled in our strategic analysis, had not participated in debate on it, did not read our books, much to our amazement, but in fact he needed reading glasses. He didn't get that message. The message he got is, look, boy, this isn't bad at all. I can survive under this. I can make administrative arrangements. Get my stuff in at Haiphong, get it in on the 2 railroads from the north, from China, ship it down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's not bad at all. In fact, what we did to North Vietnam is inoculate them against air power. By administering it in gradual doses, they've built up a tolerance to it. Now, it's quite true that the bombing has been an egregious disappointment. That doesn't mean it's had no effect at all. Nor does it mean, we know from experiments that have been conducted in bombing pauses, what happens when we stop bombing all of North Vietnam. As you know, we're now bombing up to the 19th parallel, about 120 nautical miles north of the 17th parallel. We know what's happened. What's happened is that they send 100 times as much, and they get a free ride. And we have troops there that require protection. We have North Vietnamese troops that are facing that need resupply, that are in short supply today because of the level of the campaign they've conducted. To do this without any purpose, except as a device to get us to ensure that we're driven out of there, sounds to me like folly. Now let me turn very briefly to one of Adam's other remarks, that of the home front. I never in all my adult life ever suggested, nor did Adam say I suggested, but I want to make this point crystal clear, that we can afford to wage a war without paying attention to the home front. In fact, I've suggested publicly and in writing that we can afford to do both. That we're not doing both I find to be mystifying and in part quite disgusting. It is not a question of trading one set of resources for another. It's a question of emphasizing and considering that defending the home front is part of national defense. And I would hope that all candidates for high office this year of '68 have that general notion. Now, one of the difficulties that faces us in Vietnam is that it's simply of momentum. We're a big country. An individual can wake up tomorrow morning and say, I changed my mind. Instead of going north tomorrow, I'm going south. That's up to an individual. He's got a hell of a short turning radius. A big country with troops overseas, with ships on the high seas, with a pipeline system, with a commitment that's public and visible, can't turn around even if it would like to. And I'm suggesting that we just can't. I'm also saying we shouldn't. Because if I were to believe, or that someone could persuade me, that really there's no way out, there's no hope, that if we were to lose in 3 years, we just have the 3-year cost from now on added to the cost which we've already paid and invested, but that we're guaranteed to lose, then I might feel as Adam does about it. I don't feel that way, therefore I don't feel as he does. Now, one of the difficulties in looking at the bombing of South Vietnam is that we're seeing it through narrow-angle television. I hate to agree with Marshall McLuhan on anything, but damn this television anyway. The nature of television is such that it's got to give you a narrow-angle image. When I was out of the city and watched Watts burn on television from San Francisco, I thought all of L.A. was up in flames. But that's the nature of the medium. It's got to give you the narrow-angle view and fill the frame. It's not really like that in South Vietnam. Not that I'm trying to gloss over the deaths, the casualties, the discomfort, the wrecking of homes, the refugee problem, but that's war. Saying that alone doesn't make it just or honorable, but above all, we should ask not only ourselves, we should ask the South Vietnamese people what they like. To my taste, they've given all evidence to date of wanting to continue.
Thank you. Mr. Ermolinsky, do you have comments?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. On the issue of the effect of negotiations by the South Vietnamese government with the NLF on the negotiations between the United States and Hanoi, I suggest that these are not analogous to the sale of Mr. Katz's car, because we're talking about two separate transactions, and I think we've got to make it quite clear that we are talking about two separate transactions. We are negotiating with Hanoi about the withdrawal of their forces and our forces from South Vietnam. We should not get embroiled in the eventual resolution of the issue between the contending South Vietnamese forces which are engaged in that country. And I think one way to make the separation quite clear is to have those two kinds of negotiations going on at the same time in different places. Now, on the bombing issue, I'm afraid all I can say is that on the basis of everything I know, I am in flat disagreement with Mr. Katz. I had occasion to supervise a study in which we tried to figure out what way we could change the pattern of bombing and the incidence of bombing in the North in order to stop or slow down the flow of supplies to the South. And we came up with the conclusion that there was no way it could be done. There were lots of ways that looked good on the surface, but none of them actually worked. Now, the notion that we should not allow Hanoi a free ride, the fact is that they can do it with bombing, they can do it without bombing. It is somewhat more difficult for them to do it with bombing, but the effect of the bombing is to prevent the negotiations from going forward in the spirit in which they'd go forward without the bombing, and it doesn't do us any good militarily to have the bombing. Now, the only additional point, the last point I want to make is on the issue of momentum. Sure, this is a big country and a powerful country, and if we ever go down, if we ever lose what we have as a country that's important, and it's not our size, and it's not our power, it's not our wealth, it's the spirit and the character of this country, if we ever lose it, we will lose it, I suggest, because we pay more attention to our power and our wealth and our status in the world than we do to what we believe in and what we think we ought to be doing. And I suggest that if the problem is one of momentum, we better address ourselves to how we can begin applying the brakes and turning the steering wheel and getting the ship around, because if we don't do it in reasonably short compass, it's going to be that much harder to do it as we move on in the direction that we're now going. And I suggest also, and again with apologies to your chairman, that we ought to think very seriously about the people who are now presenting themselves as candidates for the presidency and pick the man who has the greatest chance because he's got the greatest strength of character and has shown the greatest capacity to turn this country around and do the job that's involved in making that turn come fast.
Thank you. On behalf of the Associated Students of UCLA and the Thomas Jefferson Club, I would like to thank the participants for coming and the audience. I would now like to invite the audience, if they would like, to adjourn with the participants to the men's lounge for a short question and answer period. Thank you.